Wow.
And I say that turning to Willie because the first time I met Dr. McKether was sitting in a class with him at Wayne State University. He was finishing, I was just starting up. And, but I never read Dr. McKether's, his bio until today when I said, oh, I have to introduce him tonight. He has a very interesting background because his advanced education started at Grand Valley State University with a bachelor's in economics. And then he earned his MBA in finance. And now he has his PhD in anthropology with a specialty in oral history. And I said, how did you make that right turn? And he said, because it felt right. And I'll let him explain that. I have found listening to Willie fascinating in class. I know he has done outstanding work as an oral historian, preserving the stories of African Americans who had their own journey within this country. And I know he continues to do that work and is scheduled to publish 2 books now, and is just a delight. So without further ado, would you please warmly welcome Dr. Willie McKether.
Well, thank you, Lorraine, for that very warm introduction, and thank you to the Society for welcoming me here this evening. So how did I get from business to anthropology? I get that question quite often. You know, people say that a discipline will sometimes choose you. I think in some respects, anthropology chose me first. As I was going through the MBA program and thinking about finance and entering the corporate world, something just wasn't clicking with me. Coming from a blue-collar family in Saginaw, having my dad and brother both in the UAW, you know, I was used to hearing stories about the struggles of people who did not always have a voice, who didn't always have power. And for the MBA program in business, it was mostly about management making decisions. And so when I got to Wayne State, someone said to me, you should look at anthropology. And my first thought of anthropology was, well, I don't dig in dirt. You know, that has nothing to do with me whatsoever, until a colleague introduced me to something called cultural or business anthropology. She said, well, you must realize that organizations are comprised of cultures, they are cultures, and they need people who can bring some level of business understanding to the organization from a cultural perspective. Ah, okay, that makes sense. And so I made this transition, and it really felt comfortable, it felt right, because most of the discussions we began to have in anthropology dealt with people who were at the grassroots, focused on the people who sometimes, again, did not have a voice, and giving a voice to the voiceless. So for me, that was my initial interest. So then how did I move to studying migration and using oral histories as a way to document Black life? As a student at Wayne State, I remember so well taking a class in industrial anthropology. And we were required in that class to study some form of industrial life. And I thought, well, that's easy for me. You know, I'll go back home to Saginaw where I'm known. I'll go to the public library. I'll get books, papers on Black life or Black industrial life, because I knew that General Motors was a very important part of life in Saginaw. So I figured, you know, I'll go to the library, spend a couple of hours, whip out a 15-page paper, I'm done over the weekend. Get to the library, and to my surprise, I realized that there was very little documentation. I think, wait a minute, but there are a lot of Black people in Saginaw. Where is the story of African-American migration, where they lived? I'd heard all kinds of stories about people being confined to certain parts of the city, and it wasn't there. And I then began to interview, initially, about 10 or 15 gentlemen that I would find always parked at a McDonald's restaurant between 8 and 10. Every weekday, I would go there, and they're there parked having coffee. So one day I just went there, just kind of cold calling, just sat there and said, hey guys, tell me about your lives here in Saginaw. And their stories were just fascinating. From the reasons they left the South, their struggles to get here, to Michigan, but then also once they got here, what that adjustment was actually like. And so once I interviewed those 10 gentlemen, for me, it's like I couldn't stop. Like, I need to tell the story, because what they would tell me over and over again, we're going to tell you this story, and we're dependent upon you to tell our story right and to get it right. And so from there, I chose to do my dissertation actually on migration to Saginaw, Michigan. And so my talk tonight really is telling Black history in the context of a migration. As an anthropologist, I'm interested in culture, I'm interested in patterns of culture, I'm interested in change in time, change across time and across space. And so anthropology and migration enables me to do that. And so I've extended my study from Michigan as well as to Ohio. So I'll include some discussion of migration pattern in both Michigan as well as in Ohio. So the primary time I'll deal with really is 1920 through 1940, because from what I can understand, in my understanding, that was a time of large migration from the South to parts north. I should say, what I always have to confess to my students on the first day of class, so I figured I'll give you my confession also. I come from a long line of stutterers in my family. Growing up, my dad both stuttered, my mom stuttered, so as a child growing up, I was afraid to talk. I was really embarrassed to talk because I figured people they sort of made fun of me. And so, as you can imagine, I never imagined myself being a college professor or even speaking in front of a group. And so I tell you that because I still, even now, sometimes get stuck on a word. It just won't get out. And you have my permission to chuckle, to laugh, because now it's funny to me even when I do it. But it's one of those challenges that you overcome, and now I look back on it, it's like, wow, what a journey, what a journey. So the period I'll be discussing largely is 1920 to 1960, but I want to at least start back a little bit earlier, looking at 1890 through 1920, because it's through looking back, it provides some indication, some clues about the later time period. And so looking at patterns and themes. So as an anthropologist, I'm interested in patterns and themes across different cities with respect to migration. So what do we know happened between 1890 and 1920 with respect to migration? We know that African Americans were largely excluded from organized labor. With very few exceptions, African Americans were not allowed, once they migrated from the South to places like Toledo, places like Detroit, places like Saginaw, African Americans were not allowed to join unions, in particular the craft unions, During this time period, African Americans, or should I say immigrants, were largely preferred over African Americans. As immigrants were coming from Eastern, Southern Europe, for employers, their preference were not for people from the South, but rather they were for immigrants. Which meant that African Americans were largely relegated to doing service kinds of work, which meant it paid less, but that's all they could do. For women, it was largely day work, such as what you see in The Help. It was the kind of work that most women were able to do. And for barbering in particular, and I found this to be true across every city I've looked at, up until African Americans were able to become good barbers in most communities, up until about the 1890s, when Germans started to come to most communities, African Americans across the board lost their specialty as being barbers. I'm not sure how to explain that, but across every city I've looked at, the 1890s, African Americans lost that profession. During this time period, eager African American workers were used largely as strike breakers. Coming from the South, wanting to get a job doing something, capitalists or business owners say, tell you what, we will hire you because there was a time of heightened tension in the workplace also. And so when workers went on strike, well then here you now have these people coming from the South looking for work, and so they were used as strike breakers. And we begin to see the emergence of Negro jobs, or the kinds of jobs in particular that employers felt African American men were better suited for because, of course, they came from the South. White paternalism. People like Henry Ford in Detroit and George Pullman in Chicago. People in particular who were anti-union would, from the pulpit of all places, encourage African American leaders to have their other migrants not to join the union. And in return, not for joining the union, contributions were then made to various churches, to various organizations. And so in some cases, pastors and churches in places like Detroit and Pontiac benefited because they were getting money from people in exchange for them denouncing or encouraging people not to join the union. We saw the growth of secular organizations such as the Urban League. As African Americans were migrating to places north, they didn't really know how to settle in those places. Or they would get to places like Chicago, Saginaw, Detroit, Flint, not really knowing where to go, just coming here for work. Didn't matter where, they would get here on buses the best way they could. And so we see the growth of places like the Urban League. We see churches during that time period, their roles began to take on roles other than just religion, but also became places social as well during that time period. And more importantly, or I guess and interestingly, there was residential integration. In that there's something about when the black population was small in most communities, they were welcomed. As the population began to grow in most communities, that it turned from being welcomed to, we don't want you here now. So I want to just kind of show here just some migration numbers. I'm not sure if you can see that this well in the back or not. But if you see, I start here with Cincinnati, Toledo, Detroit, Flint, Pontiac, Saginaw, then Chicago from 1890 through 1920. And if you'll note from between 1910 and 1920, the populations take a big spike in Cincinnati, which is one of the furthest cities, one of the first cities you get to from the South. So a lot of people were stopping in Toledo, or excuse me, in Cincinnati before getting to Toledo, so the numbers tend to drop. If you look at the black, now this is just the black population in these communities. In Detroit, in 1910, the black population was little less than 6,000, but between 1910 and 1920, it goes from little more than almost 6,000 to about 40,000 people. But then in Flint, Pontiac, Saginaw, the numbers are really small, suggesting that people, once they got to Detroit, hey, we're good. We're going to stop right here and get a job. You're going to get one of those jobs that Henry Ford was hiring people during. This was doing in part the $5 a day move by Henry Ford. This was during after World War II, when people were not, immigrants were not coming to the U.S. because of the war. And so we see this large spike in African Americans in both Michigan and in Ohio. Now, so in addition to what we call the Great Migration, that period of 1916 to about 1619, in addition to that, we also see in the early 20s the emergence of a cadre of men that were intelligent, brave, confrontational in their appeals for equality, and this new cadre of men was dubbed rather the New Negro. And it has its roots in Harlem, part of the Harlem Renaissance. It included people like A. Philip Randolph, who became president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and which, by the way, people don't talk about the important role of women in the migration, people like Ida B. Wells, because we now know that without an Ida B. Wells, they would not have been a successful A. Philip Randolph. W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Claude McKay, just many others, and these were part of the intelligentsia, people who were saying, we want equality now, and they went about it in a very confrontational yet intelligent way. Now, ultimately, these men didn't all get along, which led to part of the demise of this new Negro cadre, but the point being, this was part of people who were saying, who engaged in what we call protest politics. We want rights now, not later. So, but what I say though, while good things were happening in places like New York and people were employed in the South, in good jobs in the North, blacks in the South were still suffering. They continued to experience domination by whites, dependency, exploitation, almost at the same levels that they had during slavery. I mean, so while there was some reason to celebrate in the places like New York, people were working in the North. In the South, people were still suffering. So I always say we shouldn't shout too soon. What were the conditions like in the South? So tonight I'll talk about not only about what the culture was like for people once they got here, but what conditions pushed people out of the South as well. What was going on in the South that caused people to say, I should get out of here? Well, we saw the continuation of a black-white caste system. And of course, a caste system, or I call it a caste-like system, a system where one group is considered superior over the other, where the inferior group is expected to pay some kind of deference behavior, such as always yielding, going to the back door, or even just through honorifics or just titles being attached to someone's name, such as Mr. or Miss, or even just being arrested for what was known as reckless eyeballing. What was reckless eyeballing? That was when black men were arrested for looking at white women. And so that was a thing where men understood when they saw a white woman to pay deference, they were taught very early to look down, never look up. If you see a white person coming towards you, you step off the sidewalk, you give them deference. Always go to the back door. So these were the conditions that were going on. Of course, there was Jim Crow, or the strict segregation laws. And I would say these segregation laws reproduced systems of domination. People began to understand their place. And in my interviews with people who came from the South, and I'll get to these in just a minute, one theme that continued to emerge was the notion of staying in their place. People understood that in order to survive living in the South, they had to stay in their place. And their parents taught them that. Also in the South was all King Cotton. And this existed throughout the early 40s, late 40s, early 50s, where in this system, in this feudal-like system, wealthy whites were able to, they provided homes for blacks to live on, which some would call shacks. Blacks were not allowed to vote, of course, and for those who tried to vote, they could be evicted from their homes. Kids couldn't go to school because the cotton picking season typically was in the fall, and so black children were typically the ones left home or told, stay home until all the cotton has been picked at some point later in the fall. And so it's during this time period where cotton continues to dominate the system. So now moving back up north, what was going on in the North between 1920 and 1940? Here we begin to deal with the question of whether people were pulled or pushed. And so for some scholars, they argue more that they were pulled or lured to the North in search of a better life, in search of employment. Others would suggest, no, they were pushed. They had to leave those conditions of the South. Oftentimes when I interviewed men who grew up between 1930 and 1950 in the South, I would ask them the extent to which they felt as if they were still men because they left the South. And many said, no, I left the South because I knew had I stayed there, I would have hurt somebody. There's no way I would have stayed there. I wasn't my daddy. My daddy took it because he had to protect his family. But if a person said something to me, I was fighting. And so for these men, they say to me that they still feel that they were brave men. We see that African Americans were still assigned mostly to foundry work, But then after the emergence and growth of the UAW, we began to see African American men join unions and begin to see them take leadership positions. We began to see shifting white racial intolerance, again, as the population of African Americans increased. And again, I'm not sure of that tipping point. There's some point in most communities where after the population got to be a certain number, there was intolerance. Let's now find a place, let's confine these African Americans to a particular part of the city. I see my colleague Andrew Newman here, who's an urban anthropologist, so at some point he can enlighten us on what that tipping point may very well be. We'll begin to see continued racism in public places, in that African Americans were not allowed to eat in certain restaurants in the North. If they did, they were certain places. Even going to movie theaters, African Americans could not sit on the main floor. You know, what I found interesting in my interviews with people, I was shocked, I guess, to be honest with you, because the things that people described to me that happened in the North, you thought they were talking about the South. It's like, are you kidding me? You mean here in Michigan, African Americans couldn't go to a restaurant? If they went to a theater, they sat in the balcony and they had no choice. If people went to a restaurant, if they did sit and eat at a restaurant, the food could have been too salty, cold, something of the nature. Or I've been told by many migrants that a person would take their plate and break it after they finish eating to suggest, look, okay, you've eaten this out of this plate is done now. I mean, so things weren't that rosy in the North in a social context. Economically, people were better off, but socially, not so much. Again, so residential segregation, and we see the growth of so-called race businesses. Those businesses that catered primarily to the needs of a growing black population. People coming from the South were used to a certain kind of cuisine, certain kind of food, need to have their hair styled a particular kind of way. And plus, because they were not really welcomed at stores and restaurants outside of their communities, they had to develop a commerce within the confines of where they were actually living. We also saw the growth of churches, and that's a whole different lecture, the growth of black churches and how those churches themselves became segregated based on status, based on skin color within the black community. So there was stratification, if you will, within the black community, and some would even argue or even question the extent to which that even exists today. A different topic, however. So the period of 1940 through 1960, I sort of look at two periods, a period of transition and then a period of transformation. 1940 to 1954, things started to change for African Americans in the North, or in many ways, they themselves started to change. In 1950s to 1960s, a period of transformation. So I go back now to looking at numbers. We see, in particular, between 1940 and 1950, a decent spike in African American populations in these various communities. But you see, in Detroit, the population almost doubles. In Flint, it more than doubles. In Pontiac, it gets larger. In Saginaw, it even gets larger. So what's going on? This was a period certainly after the Depression, after the war. You had pent-up demand. People were hiring lots of people in industry. We know that it was the first time where African American women, maybe women in general really, were able to really work in the foundries. And so we see a large population growth during this particular time. Veterans who were returning home from the war tell an interesting story. I had the privilege of interviewing several World War II veterans to understand what life was like for them, both while they were in the military, but also once they returned home. And I heard several stories from veterans during my interviews who talked about, they would come home proudly in their uniforms, but had to take them off before they really went home. In particular in the South, because those men who then had pride, who had fought for the country, their countries, they were said to be uppity. And they were oftentimes targeted. They were targeted. Their families were targeted simply because they came back with a sense of pride and loving who they were. So, but the conditions, I interviewed, in my studies, I've interviewed probably nearly 200 people about their experiences. And a common theme that I hear from migrants who came from the South, I mentioned this to you a little bit earlier, the following. I saw no difference in blacks here than down South. The only thing down South, you knew where you were supposed to be. Here you weren't shown where you're supposed to be. So again, the conditions here were very similar. In the South, they would tell you, you can't come in here. Your kind is not welcome. Here in the North, they wouldn't say it, but you knew it. You weren't welcome. So some very similar social conditions existed here in the North, just as it did in the South. But I suggest that the black experience in Michigan and Ohio mirrors the rest of the country between 1940 and 1954. The disparate treatment that started between 1920 and 1940 continued between 1940 and 1954. Racism continued in public places. African Americans were continually placed in the worst factory jobs, shakeout in the core room, pouring iron. All the most difficult jobs were largely assigned to African Americans. Residential segregation continued, and we see the development even of sundown towns in parts of Michigan. I don't know if we had any sundown towns in Troy or not, but I know from one author, James Loewen, we had sundown towns in Owasso, we had them in Warren, and in other places in the South, in Michigan and Ohio. So what are sundown towns? That's a question. I don't know if you're familiar with the sundown towns. Let me ask you all, are you familiar with that term, a sundown town?
Yes.
No. Okay.
Is that where you're supposed to be inside at sundown?
Well, depending on who you were. Sundown town said whites only within the city limit after dark. And so there were towns that said, you don't get caught if you're a black person. When the sun go down, you better be off the street. Even in the North. In the North, those conditions existed. Now, I interviewed one gentleman, and I'll read this is a long quote, but I just couldn't resist putting this in here to give you a sense of what a sundown town is and where it comes from. This guy told me in his interview, and I'll read it to you if you can't see this far. And this was in the South. In the South, a little bit of context. So in the South, they would pick cotton either on their own farm, or if they didn't have their own farm, landowners would go through and pick up people in a wagon and transport them from one city to the next to only work during that day. So they would get them at sun up, they'd get them all up, and then when the sun started to go down, they had to get them out. This guy told me his experience. He said, put it this way, we'd go up there and chop and pick cotton all day long, but at sundown, hence sundown towns, we had to get out. They'd come and they'd get and take us there on the truck to pick and chop cotton, but we couldn't be up there at night. They would say, just get them out, just get them out. In that community, you couldn't be up there when the sun go down. You could go up there and work during the day, but they, meaning even the owners, wanted to make sure to get these laborers out of here before the sun went down. If you got caught up there at night, you were sure to be lynched. Those are just the rules. People understood that. And this is a gentleman who retired from General Motors. This interview was done in 2003, and the place is Wetumpka, Alabama. And strangely enough, when he retired, he went back to that very same town. Okay, let me move forward a little bit here. Even World War, so during this period of transitions, we begin to see changing expectations of African Americans. Returning World War veterans began to want more. They had gone to the war and fought for the country. They came back home. Yes, they had a new attitude. I deserve every right as a soldier that fought next to me, and now when I come back to this country, I get disrespected. A guy told me from Saginaw on his way from California, he was able to ride in a normal car until he got to Michigan. When he got to Michigan, while in uniform, he was forced to ride in the caboose or ride in the car with animals from some part of Michigan all the way to Saginaw. And of course, he told me this story with eyes full of tears. People began to demand merit-based pay. We see the growth of a number of teachers in Michigan. Okay, we're going to ignore that. That's my cell phone. That's my ringtone. We'll just ignore that for now. People began to demand merit-based kinds of employment. We begin to see leaders emerge black leaders emerge in the UAW. A new generation comes of age. We see new leadership. We now begin to see the children of the first wave of migrants coming of age now, who now have a better sense of themselves, and the continued growth of the so-called race businesses. Just a quick quote here from, in fact, the same returning World War II veteran that was forced to ride to Saginaw with animals, he told me this. And all the young men that went to the Army had came home then. So we decided we were going to go to every white establishment to get waited on. We would just sit there until they called the police or go to jail to break this racial barrier thing down by coming to a white restaurant. We did it because we were fighting for freedom and won the war, and we wanted discrimination to end. That was kind of the attitude of many of the World War II veterans. Now, we were very fortunate to get this guy's interview. That was done in 2003, and he passed away in 2011. We know that efforts to deny black equality continued throughout the 1950s. And so the black experience between 1955 and 1960, it was a time period where I'm suggesting the ideal American society gets exposed. During the civil rights movement in particular, in the South, we had Martin Luther King. People were now watching more television. And what was going on in the South was now being viewed all over the world. And what was going on locally, everyone could now see. So the notions of freedom, of everybody being free in this country to pursue their own self-interest. Some would say full of contradiction. Everybody being equal. Everybody, notion of individualism, you pursue your own self-interest so long as it doesn't impede on someone else. If you work hard, you can get material gain. The questions became, do these American values apply to everyone equally? And the larger questions are there contradictions. Whom are we talking about when we talk about these things about being an American? So the period of transformation was, I think, in many ways ushered in by mass discontent in the South and the civil rights movement. People were fed up by what was going on. The Brown versus Board decisions, the Emmett Till murder, all these things helped to fuel the bus boycott, and people began to fight back. New leadership emerged in a new confident African American. People like Martin Luther King, James Shuttleworth, there were many, many others. And I have to say this, because people talk about black history, seem to only talk about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. There were so many other people who were critical in the fight for civil rights in the South. They were just two people. Some could ask the question, if it had not been them, could it have been somebody else? And I believe so. I believe so. I think Dr. King certainly had a charisma, a great orator, really intelligent, but if not him, could somebody else have led that struggle, because people were then fed up. You don't get a social movement going until people get fed up. People were fed up, they were sick and tired. It's Fannie Haynes who said what? She was sick and tired of being sick and tired. People were just tired. And so we see the emergence now of what we now dub the new Negro. This was a Negro who was confrontational and believed in grassroots organizing. So the new Negro came from the Harlem Renaissance era, but then the next generation, which would have been Dr. King's father, which some people would say that generation were more accommodationist, they accommodated more. But then with people like Dr. King and his friends, then they were more confrontational. So you see this sort of this new Negro. We begin to see a fight for black rights and equality. People like Dr. King, who worked within the system for change, versus a Malcolm X, who worked outside the system for change. He wanted to revolutionize. But these men, in many ways, understood the same struggle, had different ways of achieving it. Some would ask if these men had lived longer, with their visions, would they have come together at some point? I think they would have. I think they would have, because I think slowly they were coming together, they respected each other, and I think Malcolm's perspective was, well, if you don't deal with Dr. King, then I'm your alternative. So we begin to see everybody engage in this struggle for rights of African Americans. Young adults in particular played an important part. You had CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. You had SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. These groups were critical in advancing civil rights for African Americans in the South, which happened to spill over also in the North. And we know that the black churches in the North were critical, because it was through the black churches that African Americans were able to continue their struggle. As the institution primarily owned and operated by African Americans, they felt the freedom to do so. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was comprised of a number of young people who initially fought alongside Dr. King, but ultimately who saw him too cautious and too old. By then, Dr. King is not 30 years old. But for these youngsters, then Dr. King, he was too old and too cautious because they wanted things to move quickly. And of course, that's John Lewis, who was a member of SNCC. This guy is sort of an unknown sort of hero who was critical in the civil rights movement, but his approach was different. I think he was somewhere in between Malcolm and Martin. Rather than saying, you know, I'm not going to go look for you, but if you come bothering me, I'll be ready for you. And so this is Robert F. Williams, and he was the president of the NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina. And he's famous because he and the African Americans in North Carolina, they armed themselves. You see it now. This is 1940s, 1950s, saying, if people come looking for me, I'll be ready for them. We aren't going to be scared. And so he's famous for, well, there's a book that's named after him, and there's a movie also called Negroes with Guns. And he tells the story of how that came about in North Carolina when whites were about to lynch some African Americans. They didn't realize that Robert F. Williams and group were armed. And so when the whites came to lynch this African American, they came out with guns, ready to shoot. And someone said, well, my goodness, those Negroes got guns. And hence, Negroes with Guns really is stuck. And that's what he's known for, saying, I'm not going to fight. But now, Robert F. Williams was really forced to leave the country and move to Cuba for a number of years and was only able to come back, I think, after things sort of died down. But he was not allowed to stay in part because of his confrontational stance. I'll be wrapping up in 1 second. I got 4 more slides, I'll be done. So in the post-1960 environment, we began to see confrontational politics and national and local ethnic pride movements begin to emerge, beginning with the Black Panther Party. These were, again, young people who were mobilizing for change. Some would say they were radical in their ways, but these were now a new generation of African Americans who said, we've witnessed our parents go through lots of stuff. In our own communities, we don't have ownership of anything. We're going to mobilize and we're going to fight to get the things that we think we ought to have in various communities throughout the United States. They wanted many things, but the basic things that they, as many other African Americans, wanted in this time period. They wanted freedom, they said. They wanted economic power. We said we want power. It wasn't so much political power. It was economic power. They wanted full employment. They were tired of seeing people unemployed. They wanted decent housing. Because again, we didn't have a fair housing ordinance. And so people then were being residentially redlined. They couldn't get a mortgage. Most people I interviewed, many of them said that they had to buy their first property on land contract. These were attorneys, African American attorneys, physicians, who could not purchase a home. They wanted decent education. They wanted education that expressed the history of African Americans, not of everybody else other than African Americans. So what's the outcome then of this struggle? We see more access to jobs, higher paying jobs after the 1960s in this struggle over time, open housing ordinances and laws throughout Michigan, just a large increase in the number of black teachers in many schools. In most communities I've looked at, it's something that period between 1945 and 1960, just a huge number of black teachers. Block grant monies began to flow into different communities, community action programs, and what blacks wanted, they wanted to have some control over that government money that was coming into those communities. So as I wrap up, 2 things, significant outcomes. The worldview of black migrants, culture was transferred from the South to the North. African Americans came to the North with a strong work ethic, with a strong commitment to kin and friends. So this migration, while it was a labor migration, it was also a labor that was rooted in kin as well. One person would come from the South. They would then what they call sponsor somebody else. Just come on down, live with me until you can get on your feet, no rent, just come here. And of course, General Motors played a big part in this because they would send labor agents to the South to recruit people, even sending tickets to people, a one-way ticket to people saying, if you come down here, we got good pay for you. I have advertisements to prove that. A strong religious base, a value and commitment to education, and of course, racial solidarity, and hopes and dreams. I think one of the most significant things that came out of the black migration of this time period is hope and this vision of community ownership and pride that was expressed by the Black Panthers. This hope for a better life was passed on from these migrants to their children. All these migrants really wanted was for their children to have a good life, a good education, not have to live in fear of being lynched or beaten, being able to go to a restaurant and eat and not be turned away. And so those were the things I think that were passed on from one generation to the next. Now, some would argue some social scientists would argue that part of the problem with today's society across any ethnic group is that perhaps that notion of a better life has not been passed on from one generation to the next. And I end with this quote by Frederick Douglass, who said, "If there's no struggle, there's no progress." And so what I've just described to you is a time period between 1920 through 1940 of struggle by African Americans. This migration was facilitated by labor, but once African Americans got to places in the North, they struggled. They fought for rights, and out of that came progress. And that's the same kind of progress that we're hoping to achieve even today. So I thank you very much for your time and your patience. So I don't know if there's time. I'd be happy to take any questions, discussion. Yes, sir, in the back.
You took us up through the 1960s, and the tables you showed the migration patterns. Between 1960 and now, how would those tables look?
I would say you'd almost see those numbers decreasing, almost a Benwick backing curve almost, because in many ways the same factors that brought people to places like Michigan and Ohio are now pushing them out. Because again, many people that were coming here, they were coming because of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. Now they're leaving because of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. So I think those numbers, you know, there'll be a lot less. Places like Flint, as we know, it's I wouldn't call it a dead city, but it's decimated when General Motors left. And again, you know, we can discuss why they left, if they should have left or not. But the fact is, when large organizations or employers leave a community, they take a lot with them. Okay. So I think it would be, you'd see a lot fewer, at least with respect to, I think, the population overall, but African Americans even more so.
Thank you.
My mother hired as she called her. They were not called black people in 1947 after the Second World War. A Negro woman, Frances was her name. And let me tell you, my mother and I had never been down south. We did not know one thing about conditions down south. The day Frances, the first day she came, when she came, I was home from high school, I was in high school. I set the table for our lunch for 3, and she came, put the food on her plate, and started to go into the basement. As I say, we knew nothing about the South. My mother looked at her and said, "Where are you going, Frances?" And she said, "In the basement to eat her lunch." And my mother said, "Why?" Because at that time, we would go down to Hudson's and eat our lunch, and Negro people would eat with us, you know, we didn't know anybody, so they would sit at our table, but they, you know, so we were used to them being around us all the time. And she said that she was going to eat her lunch in the basement, and my mother said, "Why?" You know, she said, we set the table in the kitchen, and she said, "Well, I never eat with white people that I work for." And then my mother asked her 3 questions, and I thought, I'm sitting there saying, "Oh wow, where's Mom going?" And she said to Frances, she said, "Do you believe in God?" And she said, and Frances answered her this way, "Yes, ma'am, I do." And my mother said, "And do you believe God made you?" And she said, "Yes, ma'am, I do." And then my mother, the 3rd question was, "Do you go to church on Sunday?" And she said, "Yes, I do." And my mother stood there and said, "Frances, I believe God made me. I believe that I go to church on Sunday. All the things that I ask you are the same as mine. And nobody in my house eats in the basement when I eat here. So you sit down and you eat with us. And let me tell you, we learned an awful lot about the South that we did not know. Separate drinking fountains, lavatories, school. She went through high school at black school. So many things. Also traveling down to, she came from Alabama, traveling down to Alabama, had to pack a lunch because they had to wait until a restaurant was run by a black person and it would say Negro people accepted. So we had a real education. She also was going to med school to advance to get a better job. She worked 2 years for us. But before she left, she invited us to tea at her house, which was down in Harbor Stadium.
Interesting.
And we went, and we had a lovely visit before she left work from us. So we learned an awful lot from her.
Well, you know, culture is something, culture, generally speaking, is a way of life. We're socialized a particular kind of way. It sounds as if your mother and you were socialized, enculturated a particular kind of way. So your habits and customs were used to what was going on in the South. A person from the South, again, we aren't born with racist tendencies. That's a learned behavior. People from the South, they had a way of a life way of believing. Those habits gets transferred from place to place. So again, culture gets transferred. And so what you saw with Frances, that's the way in which she was raised. That's all she knew. That's all she knew. And so for many African Americans who migrated here, that's what they knew. And for many though, but they were trying to escape that. But it sounds as if you had a very fair, open-minded household.
I think it was nice because we learned so much from Frances, and Frances learned that there were white people that were not going to treat her badly, like she was used to, you might say.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm just kind of questioning your last slide on outcomes, because when I look at the present situation right now, I don't see those. I don't think that there's enough jobs for Detroit's community to exhibit a strong work ethic because there just isn't work available. I don't see, well, I can't comment on the religious space, I think that's pretty strong, but the value and commitment to education from the state and community at large to make sure that everybody has an equal chance isn't there. I mean, there's a lot of talk about it, but I don't see a lot of positive action in that regard, with the dropout rate of 58% for the Detroit public schools. A lot of these outcomes that you're suggesting, I think that there's a whole long way to go before we get there.
But let me be clear though. People talk about nostalgia, about how things used to be. These were the conditions that existed up to the 1960s. These were the kind of values that people brought with them from the South. And so these were the cultural mores that people exhibited then. Whether they exist now, also I should comment, the environment that we live in allows and requires certain kind of responses. The environment has changed. So the extent to which the environment has changed, some of these things have changed also. But at least in the 1950s and 60s, from the height of these migrations, the culture that was transferred or transplanted from the South to the North, oh, I know, my battery died. That's what happened. These were the parts of culture that were transplanted. People, in other words, people came from the South to the North with a strong work ethic. They believed in hard work. That's why they didn't mind working in the plants in those dirty jobs. It's a job. They came from the South with a very strong religious ideology. Because again, for black folk, it meant being in church on Sunday all day long. All they had to hold on to was their God. And so they came with this very so the things I list there they existed then, a different environment. The environment has shifted. When the environment changes, does it change its inhabitants? Do they have to change in order to survive the environment? Absolutely. So you're right. I agree with you. These things may not exist now in the black community because the environment has shifted. And oftentimes, when the environment shifts, people who don't have power are oftentimes the ones who bear a larger brunt of environmental change.
I'm not saying that that those values don't exist in the black community. What I'm saying is that the goals that they hope to realize through those outcomes have not been realized or have even declined.
Yeah, I do. So has the dream of Martin Luther King, was it ever achieved? So that big dream, was it ever achieved?
Obviously, we have an African-American president, and we have certainly a much larger black middle class, but we still have a huge number of folks who haven't seen that yet.
Oh, you know, does the disparate treatment still exist? Do we still have an equal number of minorities as presidents of organizations, of universities, and those types of things? No. So that dream, that utopian dream, has not been realized. Were some gains made? Absolutely yes. Is there still a long way to go? Absolutely yes. Because we have a black president, does that mean that now we've overcome and we're there? Try and tell a 19-year-old student that. A room full of them. Well, what are you talking about? We had a black president. Racism is gone now. Be happy. Not so quick. But very good point and question, though. Very good point.
Other questions?
You said our population is going down in cities like Flint, Saginaw, because of the jobs. But where are the people going to?
They're going places where the economies, I think, are not so dependent on manufacturing, in particular auto manufacturing. Jobs are plentiful in places like Dallas, Texas, parts of the South. It's the economies that are dependent upon manufacturing. I think places where there's a focus on renewable and alternative energy, green industries, those are the communities, the states where people are moving to. I mean, because
Not going back to where they came from.
well, now for people that retired, you know, the interesting point is that oftentimes they're going straight back to their hometowns. They've now retired, and of course the notion of land ownership means something. And so for many black folk who retired, you know, their parents left them a little piece of land, as they call it. And so going back home to claim that is important. But they're not going back to those places looking for jobs. They're going back now to live the leisurely life.
They came up here to live the leisurely life and the better life, and now they realize
Well, interesting though, when you look at what in the interviews, they really still call the South home. I would always say, well, I'm going back home. You know, this was a place to live, make a living, but my home, that's back where I came from. And so for many African Americans that I interviewed, the notion was, I'm going back home when I retire. That's where I come from.
I think that's not necessarily a racial thing. My parents migrated from Indiana up here, and to the day he died, he talked about my dad, you know, well, when we go home, meaning back to Indiana. That's just a human thing.
Yeah.
Where you grow up, where your heart was, where you learned your first things, where your family was, is emotionally home.
And, you know, and I think you're probably right. You're probably right. And so part of what I said earlier was that I'm interested in learning about patterns of migration. You know, so now having looked at this migration to Saginaw, to Michigan, now to Toledo and to Ohio, as an academic, Dr. Newman, and Dr. Tara back there, I see, Eden, we're wanting to develop theory. What now, is there a theory that helps to explain migrations across all ethnic groups? So now I think now I have a theory of migration that applies to African Americans, but does it apply to other ethnic groups as well? Can I now test my theory? Can I disprove it maybe even? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so we had this migration of African Americans, and they established their homes in Pontiac, Saginaw, Flint, and they had children. But for their children, this is home.
Yeah.
So what are we seeing then in terms of the X and Y generations of African Americans who were raised in blue-collar families, like I was, in Detroit, or in Saginaw, or in Flint? Where are they going?
Where are they going? Well, you know,
Do they claim this as home, or are they searching for something better someplace else?
that's an interesting question. I think what you're seeing now, you're seeing 2 or 3 generations removed. And so some of the values we just talked about, it seems as though they don't have those same kinds of values. And for some, I think for some people, they don't know life outside of the immediate community. And so when I talk to young people, I encourage them, think outside the box, do something different. Because again, the environment has shifted. The opportunities that were available to your parents, your grandparents, those things aren't here any longer. So, you know, for some they stay because this is home, all they know. For others, they're more adventurous. So I don't think there's one answer to that. I think it just kind of depends. Yeah, it really is. It really is. It really is. It really is.
Do you want to talk for just a minute about what you want to do in April with an oral history workshop?
Sure. When I come back in April, I want to train you all, or people in Troy, how to do oral history interviews. So I can see spending some time talking about the nuts and bolts of it. Here's how you do it. Here's the value in doing it. Because again, I've done interviews, both oral and video interviews. And so I want to do a workshop, really, to train people on here's how you do an oral history with an individual or even with a community. How do you do a community oral history project? What are the legal ramifications? How do you go about getting the right kinds of equipment? What kind of questions do you really ask? How do you prioritize those people? So just all the nuts and bolts. I want to share everything that I know is what it boils down to. And again, I have established 2 oral history collections. The one in Saginaw, for some reason, they call it the Willie McKether African American Oral History Collection. Don't know where that came from. And that one has about 98 to 100 oral history interviews, which are mostly transcribed. In Toledo, I've established Dream Cole African American Oral History Collection, named after a local historian, and that one has about 50 oral history interviews, and they're both tied to the local libraries. So I want to talk about how do you maximize your oral history projects, how do you write grants even to get some of those oral histories done. I'll talk about the post-production process. So I'm going to start from the very beginning and go through how do you start it to how do you finish it. I mean, so I want to, again, because I think oral histories are just so powerful. And I tell all of my students, I think, you know, I have been transformed, I think, if you will, from my conversations with people. I think that I just learned so much from common everyday people. You know, and so a lot of what I do, I enjoy talking to the history makers. Yes, that's important. But I so much enjoy talking to people who never saw a microphone, who people never asked them, who are you? Where did you come from? What was life like for you? And so I think it's critical for our children, our grandchildren, to know the history of their parents, of their grandparents, because they aren't going to be here forever. And I'll tell you this, though, one thing I really love, and I say this, the long-term memory of senior citizens. that people could tell me, look, I came to Saginaw in 1940 on a Wednesday. It was 45 degrees. The grass was green. I had this for dinner. I mean, just wonderful long-term memories. And those are the memories that I think we need to capture. So I'm a huge, huge advocate of oral history interviews as a way to capture both the individual lives of people, but also the collective lives of people as well.
I know we have one lady who said to me, I want to do an oral history project with my family. I have 2 sisters, we have so many aunts, and I need to organize that. So don't think of oral history as something that is just an academic tool. It's also a family tool. And I think the saddest thing is walking into a funeral home and hearing one relative say to another, you know, we always meant to record Aunt Lucy's stories, and we didn't. So I think it's our obligation, and as we get older, as we all get older, we become the bearers of the stories. And if we lose them, if we lose that connection, then it's lost forever. There's also something incredibly powerful to turn on a tape recorder and hear the voice of someone who you don't have anymore, and to be able to hear it again. So please think about what you're going to do on April 21st, and I hope you'll be back here and that we can have a really excellent workshop with Willie. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you.